38th parallel, Korea. He was a 24-year-old second lieutenant from Ohio who had never fired a weapon in anger. His name was Philip Day, and on the morning of June 24th, 1950, he wrote a letter home from his post near Seoul, telling his mother that Korea was quiet and that he hoped to be stateside by Christmas. He was stationed with the Korean Military Advisory Group, part of the American presence tasked with training the Republic of Korea's army. He was doing paperwork and watching Korean summer arrive and thinking about Ohio. 14 hours after he sealed that letter, 75,000 soldiers of the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel on a 150-mile front. They had 150 Soviet-built T-34 tanks and artillery that opened up at 4 a.m. along the entire length of the border. The South Korean army, the force Philip Day's colleagues had been training, had no tanks and no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping what was coming. In most sectors, they broke and ran within hours. The Korean peninsula had been divided at the 38th parallel in August 1945 by two American colonels using a National Geographic map purchased at a drugstore, working in a 15-minute session at midnight to determine where Soviet forces would accept Japan's surrender in the north and American forces would accept it in the south. It was meant to be temporary, it became permanent. In the north, the Soviet Union installed Kim Il-sung, a 33-year-old Korean communist who had trained in the Red Army and fought Japanese occupation, as the ruler of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. In the south, the United States backed Syngman Rhee, a 75-year-old Princeton-educated autocrat who had spent decades in American exile. Both men claimed to represent all of Korea. Both men had been building toward this moment since 1948, when the country formally split into two rival governments. Kim Il-sung had spent the previous year lobbying Stalin repeatedly for permission to invade. Stalin finally agreed in April 1950, after the Soviet Union had tested its first atomic bomb and China had fallen to Mao Zedong's communists. The geopolitical calculus had shifted enough to make the risk acceptable. He supplied Kim with tanks, aircraft, and military advisors. He told him the Americans would not respond. Stalin was wrong about the Americans, but he was right about the timing. When Harry Truman received the phone call in Washington, D.C. on the evening of June 24th, telling him what was happening in Korea, his immediate reaction was not calculation. It was the reflex of a man who had watched the world allow Hitler to march unopposed through Europe in the 1930s and had decided he would never allow that to happen again. If we let Korea down, he said, the Soviet Union will keep right on going and swallow up one place after another. He committed American forces without asking Congress for a declaration of war. He called it a police action. And in doing so, he began one of the bloodiest and most forgotten conflicts in American history. Task Force Smith and the Long Retreat, July 1950. The Pusan Perimeter, South Korea. They flew from Japan on July 1st, 1950. 540 men of the 1st Battalion, 21st Infantry Regiment, 24th Infantry Division. They were among the first American soldiers in Korea. They were called Task Force Smith after their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith. They were under-equipped, under-trained, and operating on the assumption that the presence of American soldiers would itself be enough to stop the North Korean advance. The assumption was catastrophically wrong. On July 5th, 1950, at Osan, Task Force Smith engaged the North Korean People's Army for the first time. The T-34 tanks came through the rain on the main road south, and the Americans opened fire with everything they had: 75mm recoilless rifles, 2.36-inch bazookas, artillery. The T-34s kept coming. The anti-tank weapons bounced off the Soviet armor. The tanks drove through the American positions without stopping, and the infantry following them engaged Smith's men on three sides. Task Force Smith held for 7 hours and then collapsed. 180 casualties. The survivors ran south through rice paddies in the rain, abandoning their weapons, their wounded, and any illusion that this war would be short. The retreat that followed was one of the worst in American military history. The 24th Infantry Division, fighting desperately to slow the North Korean advance, suffered 3,602 dead or wounded and 2,962 captured by the time it reached the temporary defensive line at Daejeon. Its commanding general, Major General William Dean, was captured personally while trying to knock out North Korean tanks with a bazooka. The highest-ranking American officer captured since the Civil War, he would spend 3 years in North Korean captivity. By early August 1950, the entire Korean peninsula was in North Korean hands, except for a defensive perimeter around the port of Busan. 140 miles long, 50 miles deep, anchored to the sea. General Walton Walker, commanding the 8th Army, issued an order that would define the next 6 weeks. There would be no retreat to the sea. There would be no Dunkirk. They would stand or die. The soldiers in the Busan perimeter, American, South Korean, and the first contingents of other UN member nations arriving by ship, fought through the hottest and driest Korean summer in memory, drinking from rice paddies fertilized with human waste, losing men to dysentery alongside men lost to North Korean artillery. The war had begun with an act of aggression and continued with an American defeat. The question being asked in the Pentagon, in the White House, and in the foxholes of the Busan perimeter was whether the United States, the most powerful military in the world, fresh from defeating Germany and Japan, was actually capable of stopping what Kim Il-sung had started. The answer would come from an unexpected direction, delivered by a 70-year-old general who had never stopped believing in the audacity of the impossible. Inchon, the masterstroke and the trap. September to November 1950. Inchon, Seoul, the Yalu River. Every admiral told him it was impossible. The tides at Inchon, 32 feet, among the highest in the world, created mud flats that would strand landing craft for hours twice a day. The harbor approaches were mined. The seawall was 15 feet of vertical concrete that could only be scaled by ladder under direct fire. The strategic surprise was considered unachievable in a harbor this difficult. General Douglas MacArthur's response to every objection was characteristically absolute. Inchon was not listed in the textbook as a practicable landing beach. We shall land at Inchon, and I shall crush them. On September 15th, 1950, the 1st Marine Division went over the seawall at Inchon. By September 28th, Seoul had been liberated. By October, the North Korean People's Army was disintegrating, caught between the Inchon landing force and the breakout from the Busan perimeter. Its supply lines cut, its units surrounded and destroyed piecemeal. MacArthur's gamble had produced one of the most decisive turning movements in military history. The Korean War appeared to be over, and then MacArthur crossed the 38th parallel. The original mandate to restore the pre-war status quo, to push North Korea back to the border, was replaced by a new ambition: total victory. The reunification of Korea under a pro-Western government, the destruction of the North Korean state. On October 1st, UN forces crossed the 38th parallel. On October 7th, the UN General Assembly authorized the advance. Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai warned that China would intervene if American forces approached the Yalu River, the border between North Korea and China. MacArthur dismissed the warning. On October 15th, MacArthur met Truman on Wake Island and assured the president that Chinese intervention was very unlikely. If China did send forces, American air power would destroy them before they could be effective. MacArthur described the area between his advancing forces and the Yalu as a merciless wasteland. He told the men they would be home by Christmas. He told everyone who would listen that the war was already won. Between October 19th and 25th, 1950, approximately 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River. They moved only at night. They wore white sheets in the snow. They carried their supplies on their backs and used no radio communications that could be intercepted. They disappeared into the mountains of North Korea so completely that MacArthur's intelligence services detected almost none of them. By November 24th, the day MacArthur ordered his final offensive to the Yalu, 120,000 of those Chinese soldiers were hidden in the mountains surrounding the Chosin Reservoir, where 30,000 American soldiers and Marines were advancing toward them. The trap was set, and the most dangerous man in the American military establishment had walked directly into it. The frozen Chosin, November 27th to December 24th, 1950, Chosin Reservoir, North Korea. They woke to bugles. It was after midnight on November 27th, 1950, at the Chosin Reservoir, North Korea, at an altitude of 4,000 feet, in a mountain winter that had dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Marines sleeping in their bags were suddenly surrounded by sound. Bugles, cymbals, loudspeakers, broadcasting commands in Chinese, and voices in English from outside their perimeter. Marines, tonight, you die. Star shells burst overhead, and in their cold white light came the Chinese. Wave after wave of infantry, 120,000 soldiers of the Chinese 9th Army Group, charging the positions of 30,000 UN troops who had been confident 12 hours earlier that the war was almost over. The Marines of Fox Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines, held Toktong Pass, a critical mountain position that controlled the only road south for the entire 1st Marine Division. Captain William Barber was shot through the thigh on the first night and refused evacuation. For 5 days and 5 nights, 234 Marines held a position against repeated assault, directed by a commander lying on a stretcher who crawled between positions when standing was no longer possible. When relief finally arrived, 82 of the 234 were still standing. On the eastern shore of the reservoir, the story was darker. Regimental Combat Team 31, 3,200 U.S. Army soldiers, had been advancing along the eastern shore without the coordinated air support or resupply network the Marines had on the western side. When the Chinese attacked, RCT-31 was encircled and effectively abandoned by its higher command, later called Task Force Faith, after Lieutenant Colonel Don Faith, who tried to break out and died in the attempt, earning the Medal of Honor posthumously. Of 3,200 soldiers, only 385 escaped as organized fighting units. Most were killed, some were captured, some froze to death before either. The breakout from Chosin is one of the most extraordinary military achievements in American history. From Hagaruri to the coast at Hongnam, 78 miles of single-lane mountain road held on the high ground by tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers. The Marines fought their way out in 17 days of continuous combat at temperatures that froze the mechanisms of their weapons, froze the plasma in the medical bags, froze the feet inside the boots, froze the dead into positions where they had to be stacked on vehicles like cordwood because the ground would not receive them. General Oliver Smith, asked by a journalist whether he was retreating, gave an answer that became legendary. "We are not retreating. We are advancing in a different direction." On December 24, 1950, the last ship left Hongnam Harbor. Naval demolition teams destroyed the port facilities. As the fleet sailed south, carrying the survivors of X-Corps and nearly 100,000 Korean civilian refugees who had chosen to follow the Marines rather than remain under communist rule, the men looked back at the burning port and the mountains above it, the mountains where they had left their dead, and where MacArthur's promise of a Christmas homecoming had turned to ice and fire. MacArthur the same day submitted a formal request to Washington for 34 atomic bombs. The general dismissed, the line restored. January 1951 to July 1953. Korea, Washington, Baydok, Panmunjom. On December 26, 1950, General Matthew Ridgway arrived in Korea to take command of the shattered 8th Army. What he found was an army that had lost its confidence in its leadership, its understanding of why it was fighting, and in some units, its fundamental will to resist. The army was retreating south of Seoul again. Chinese forces had re-entered the capital in January 1951 for the second time in 6 months. The Korean War was, to all appearances, being lost. In 30 days, Ridgway rebuilt the 8th Army. He drove to every corps and division headquarters personally. He removed officers who would not fight. He insisted that his men understand what they were fighting for, not a line on a map, but the survival of South Korea. He launched Operation Thunderbolt on January 25th, 1951, and the army that had been retreating began to advance. By March 18th, Seoul was recaptured. By April, the front had stabilized near the 38th parallel. The Chinese fifth phase, an offensive 700,000 Chinese soldiers in the largest communist operation of the war, failed against Ridgway's prepared defenses in late April, costing the Chinese an estimated 70,000 casualties in the Inchon sector alone. MacArthur's end came on April 11th, 1951. He had spent months publicly contradicting the president's limited war strategy, calling for attacks on Chinese territory, demanding that nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan be used in Korea, writing letters to Republican congressmen undermining administration policy. When one such letter was read aloud in the House of Representatives on April 5th, Truman had had enough. The relief order was transmitted to Tokyo. MacArthur was having lunch with Japanese dignitaries when his wife passed him the note. "Jeannie," he said, "we're going home at last." 7.5 million people lined the streets of New York to cheer him. 3/4 of the American public sided with the general over the president. History would take longer to render its verdict, and when it did, it sided with Truman. The truce talks began at Kaesong in July 1951 and moved to Panmunjom in October. They would continue for 2 years. The central argument over whether prisoners of war could choose not to be repatriated or whether all POWs must be returned regardless of preference consumed 575 meetings and 25,000 additional American deaths. Men died on hills with numbers instead of names. Bloody Ridge, Heartbreak Ridge, Old Baldy, Porkchop Hill, fighting for terrain that would be abandoned as soon as the armistice was signed for negotiating positions at a conference table. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. His successors had no interest in prolonging a Korean war that was costing the Soviet Union resources it needed for internal power struggles. Dwight Eisenhower, elected president in November 1952 on a platform of ending the war, made quiet signals through India that nuclear weapons were being considered. The armistice was signed at Panmunjom at 10:01 a.m. on July 27, 1953. General William Harrison signed for the UN command. General Nam Il signed for the communists. Neither man spoke. Neither shook the other's hand. The signing took 11 minutes. Sobko the forgetting. 1953 to present, Kahanru, America and the war. It left behind. The soldiers came home to silence. Not the hostile silence that Vietnam veterans would later encounter, but something in some ways worse, the silence of indifference. The country they returned to had been watching television, buying houses in suburbs that were being built at a rate of 30,000 units per week, driving new Chevrolets on highways that were being poured in concrete from coast to coast. The Korean War had been happening at the same time as all of this prosperity, and the prosperity had won the competition for American attention. The soldiers filed through airports in their uniforms, and nobody met them with a band. The war itself contributed to its own forgetting. It had no victory. The armistice restored the exact situation that had existed before June 25th, 1950. Two Koreas divided at roughly the 38th parallel. Two hostile governments, one claiming legitimacy over the other. The 36,574 Americans who died had not changed any of this. They had prevented something, the subjugation of South Korea by the Kim dynasty. But prevention is not the material of triumphant narratives. America does not build monuments to prevented catastrophes as readily as it builds them to achieved victories. Then there was the problem of context. The Korean War arrived sandwiched between the most celebrated military achievement in American history, World War II, and the most traumatic, Vietnam. In the space between those two colossuses, Korea was compressed into invisibility. Veterans of World War II had ticker tape parades and the GI Bill, and a national story that placed them at the center of civilization's defense. Vietnam veterans had the wall and protests and a cultural reckoning that lasted decades. Korean War veterans had MASH, a television comedy about their war that ran for 11 years and whose final episode drew more viewers than any broadcast in American history to that point. The show was set in Korea. It was actually about Vietnam. It honored neither. Harry Truman never called it a war. He called it a police action because the United States had never formally declared war on North Korea, China, or the Soviet Union. The soldiers who served in it were, legally, participants in a UN enforcement action. The word police action followed the veterans home. It told them, in the language of government, what their country thought of what they had done. They had not fought a war, they had performed a police action. In a country whose identity is built on the narrative of its wars, the men of Korea had fought something that did not have a name the country was comfortable using. The memorial on the National Mall opened in 1995, 42 years after the armistice. The 19 steel soldiers walking through the juniper bushes, mist rising around them, faces forward into terrain they will never get through. They are still going, still advancing. They never stop and they never arrive. It is accidentally or deliberately the perfect metaphor for the Korean War veterans' experience. Always moving, always in the right direction, and never receiving the recognition of having reached the destination. The long echo 1953 to present. The war that never ended. The Korean War did not end on July 27th, 1953. It paused. The armistice agreement that stopped the shooting created a demilitarized zone, established a process for prisoner exchange, and set up the framework for a peace treaty that has never been negotiated. North Korea and South Korea are, in the legal and technical sense, still at war. The DMZ, 160 miles long, 2.5 miles wide, the most heavily mined and fortified border on Earth, is not a peace line. It is a ceasefire line. The war simply became too quiet to hear. What the war produced in human terms can be measured two ways. In the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the world's most isolated and controlled state, governed by the dynasty that started the war for 3 generations, and counting, possessing nuclear weapons capable of reaching the continental United States. Weapons developed because the Korean War taught Kim Il-sung and his successors that the only protection against American military power is a deterrent that makes attacking North Korea unacceptable. In the South, one of the most extraordinary economic transformations in human history, South Korea's GDP per capita grew from $67 in 1953 to over $33,000 today. Seoul is a world-class city of 10 million people. Samsung, Hyundai, K-pop, the Korean miracle. Both of these countries, the nuclear-armed totalitarian state and the democratic economic powerhouse, are what the Korean War produced. The 5,300 Americans still listed as unaccounted for from the Korean War represent the conflict's most persistent human obligation. Recovery teams have worked in North Korea during periods of diplomatic cooperation, carefully excavating mountainsides and valleys where men died in 1950 and were left in the frozen ground. North Korea has returned containers of remains periodically, some verified as American, some not. Some sold for financial concessions that most Americans found repugnant. Each identified set of remains goes home to a family that has kept a photograph on the mantelpiece for 70 years. They are the Korean War's most patient memorial. The lesson that the Korean War was supposed to teach: that American military intervention has limits, that civilian control of the military is non-negotiable, that limited wars have limited objectives that cannot be expanded without catastrophic consequences, was applied imperfectly in Vietnam, forgotten in Afghanistan, and relearned at enormous cost each time. The Korean War is, in this sense, not the forgotten war. It is the foundational war, the first template for every undeclared American military intervention that followed it. Its doctrine, its mistakes, its restraints, and its recklessnesses are present in every American military action of the past 70 years. Philip Day, the 24-year-old lieutenant from Ohio who wrote a letter home the night before the invasion, is saying Korea was quiet, survived. He came home in 1951. He did not talk about Korea for 30 years. When his grandchildren asked him what he did in the war, he said